5 American wars. 5 families got rich from every single one. Not speculation, government contracts. Let me show you the pattern that's made the same dynasties billions while millions died. There's a business model in American history that's more profitable than oil, more consistent than banking, more protected than any monopoly. It's made the same families wealthy for 6 generations, created dynasties that control billions in assets, funded political careers, university endowments, and charitable foundations. And it's built on a simple premise: profit from war, every war, any war. Because while soldiers die and taxpayers pay, a small group of companies always wins. The contracts are public record, the profits are documented, and the pattern is undeniable. The DuPont family, explosives and chemicals, Revolutionary War through Iraq, 220 years of war profits. The Rockefellers, oil and fuel, Civil War through Afghanistan, 160 years of energy monopoly during conflict. The Morgan banking dynasty, war financing. Spanish-American War through World War II, lending to governments and profiting from both sides. Lockheed Martin's predecessors, aviation and weapons. World War I through today, over a century of defense contracts. And Halliburton, military logistics and infrastructure. World War II through the War on Terror. 80 years of no-bid contracts and cost overruns. 5 families, 5 companies, and if you track their profits across American wars, you see the same pattern. War is declared, stock prices surge, contracts are awarded, profits explode, war ends, they keep the money, and when the next war starts, they're ready. Because they didn't just profit from war, they helped create the conditions that made war inevitable. Through lobbying, through political donations, through shaping foreign policy. This isn't conspiracy. This is capitalism applied to conflict, and the receipts are public record. Let me show you how it works, war by war, contract by contract, dollar by dollar, starting with the family that literally invented the American military-industrial complex, the DuPont family. If you've heard of them, it's probably for chemicals or Teflon, but the DuPont fortune was built on gunpowder, and they've supplied explosives for every American war since 1802. Let's start with how they positioned themselves. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont arrived in America from France in 1800. He was a trained chemist who had worked in French gunpowder mills, and he saw an opportunity. America had just fought a revolution and was expanding westward. That meant constant need for explosives, for clearing land, for mining, and for war. In 1802, he founded the DuPont Company on the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location was strategic, close to Philadelphia and Washington, access to water power for mills, and far enough from cities that explosions wouldn't cause political problems. By the War of 1812, DuPont was supplying gunpowder to the U.S. military. This was their first major government contract, and it established a pattern that would repeat for 2 centuries. War starts. Government needs explosives. DuPont is ready with existing capacity. They get the contract. They expand production. They make enormous profits. War ends. They keep the infrastructure and wait for the next one, the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. DuPont supplied gunpowder for artillery and small arms. The contract was worth over $1 million. That's about $35 million in today's money. But the real value was establishing DuPont as the government's preferred supplier. When you're the company that delivered during the last war, you're first in line for the next one. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was DuPont's breakthrough. The Union Army needed gunpowder on a scale never seen before. 4 years of continuous warfare, hundreds of battles, millions of rounds fired. DuPont's mills ran 24 hours a day. They produced over 4 million pounds of gunpowder. The contracts were worth over $10 million. That's over $300 million today, and that's just direct sales. DuPont also sold to private contractors who then sold to the government at markup. Here's where it gets interesting. The DuPont family were Northern Democrats. They opposed abolition. Some family members even supported the Confederacy politically. But they sold gunpowder to the Union because that's where the contracts were. Ideology didn't matter. Profit did. And after the war, when the Union won, DuPont was positioned as a patriotic company that helped save the nation. The complexity of their actual position was forgotten. Only the profit remained. World War I, 1914 to 1918, transformed DuPont from a large company into a dynasty. Before America entered the war in 1917, DuPont sold explosives to Britain and France. Millions of pounds of gunpowder, TNT, and smokeless powder. When America joined the war, DuPont's production increased exponentially. They built new plants, hired thousands of workers, and supplied 40% of all explosives used by Allied forces. The profits were staggering. DuPont's net earnings went from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918. That's over $1 billion today. In 4 years, they increased profits by 1,600%. And here's the critical detail. After the war, they didn't return that money. They diversified into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. They used war profits to build a peacetime empire, but they didn't stop selling to the military. World War II brought another surge. DuPont supplied explosives, nylon for parachutes, and worked on the Manhattan Project. They operated the plutonium production facility at Hanford, Washington. The contract was cost plus, meaning they were paid all expenses, plus a guaranteed profit. They couldn't lose money. The government absorbed all risk. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every conflict, DuPont or its successor companies supplied materials. By the 2000s, DuPont's defense division had been spun off and merged into other companies, but the family wealth remained. The DuPont Family Trust is worth an estimated $30 billion. 6 generations removed from Eleuthère, and they're still living off gunpowder profits. Now let's talk about the Rockefellers. Oil, the one resource every modern military needs, and the family that monopolized it for a century. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. This wasn't a business, it was a monopoly. And when America went to war, that monopoly became a strategic asset. The Spanish-American War, 1898, was small but significant. The U.S. Navy transitioned from coal to oil-powered ships in the 1890s. This made Standard Oil essential. Naval vessels needed fuel oil. The war lasted only a few months, but it established oil as a military necessity. Rockefeller supplied fuel for the fleet, and he learned a valuable lesson. Control the fuel, control the military. World War I was the first industrial war where oil was decisive. Tanks, trucks, airplanes, ships all required petroleum products. And Standard Oil, though broken up by antitrust action in 1911, still dominated through its successor companies. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, all Rockefeller controlled. They supplied fuel to the U.S. military and to the Allies. The contracts were worth hundreds of millions. But here's where the Rockefeller strategy differed from DuPont. They didn't just sell to one side. Standard Oil's German subsidiary sold fuel to Germany. Even after America entered the war, Rockefeller companies traded with Germany through neutral countries. This wasn't treason, it was business. And it was legal because the companies were technically separate entities. The profit from both sides of World War I turned the Rockefellers into the wealthiest family in America. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire. And the family diversified into banking, real estate, and philanthropy. But oil remained the foundation. World War II saw the same pattern. Rockefeller companies supplied fuel to the U.S. military. Exclusive contracts, cost plus pricing, guaranteed profits. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon's predecessor, was investigated for trading with Nazi Germany through subsidiaries. The investigation found that Standard Oil had shared patents for synthetic rubber with the German chemical company IG Farben, even after war began. This gave Germany access to technology that prolonged the war. Senator Harry Truman, before he was president, led the investigation. His committee concluded that Standard Oil's actions had damaged the war effort. But no one was prosecuted. The company was too important. The military needed their fuel. So the investigation was quietly shelved and the contracts continued. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, every conflict required oil. And Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, the Rockefeller successor companies, supplied it. The profits were so large that by the 1970s, the Rockefeller family began divesting from oil to avoid political scrutiny. But the wealth remained. The Rockefeller family fortune is estimated at $11 billion today, built on oil sold to armies that burned it while fighting wars. Now the Morgan banking dynasty, war financing. Because wars don't just need weapons and fuel, they need money. And the people who lend that money profit, regardless of who wins. J.P. Morgan founded his banking empire in the 1870s. By 1900, J.P. Morgan & Company was the most powerful bank in America. And Morgan understood something that would define a century of war profits. Governments at war will borrow at any rate. They have no choice. The alternative is losing. The Spanish-American War, 1898, was financed partly through Morgan loans to the U.S. government. Small war, small loans. But it established the relationship. The government trusted Morgan, and Morgan profited from the interest. World War I was different. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, America was officially neutral. But American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, lent money to Britain and France. Over $2 billion between 1914 and 1917. That's over $50 billion today. The loans were used to buy weapons, food, and supplies, much of it from American companies. So American banks lent money to allies who spent it buying from American companies. The money circulated, but the profit stuck to both ends. Here's the critical detail. Those loans made American neutrality impossible. By 1917, Britain and France owed so much to American banks that their defeat would have caused a financial crisis in America. If they lost the war, they couldn't repay. American banks would collapse. The economy would crater. So when President Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April 1917, it wasn't just about democracy or German aggression. It was about protecting American financial interests. Senator George Norris of Nebraska said it explicitly during the war declaration debate. "We're going into war upon the command of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He voted against the war, but Congress voted for it. And J.P. Morgan's loans were secured by American military power. After the war, Morgan profited again. Germany owed reparations to the Allies. The Allies owed money to America. Morgan arranged the loans that let Germany pay reparations, which the Allies used to repay American loans. Morgan collected fees at every step. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929, both structured by Morgan bankers, refinanced billions in war debt, and Morgan collected millions in fees. World War II followed the same pattern. Before America entered the war, Morgan banks financed British war purchases. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government borrowed heavily to fund the war effort. War bonds, Treasury securities. Morgan banks underwrote them, collecting fees on every issuance. And after the war, Morgan banks financed Reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, was administered partly through Morgan-connected institutions. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, every conflict required financing. And Morgan banks, by then merged into J.P. Morgan Chase, were always involved, underwriting government debt, financing defense contractors, profiting from the interest and fees. The Morgan family is no longer involved in day-to-day banking, but the wealth remains. The family fortune is estimated at $30 billion, built on lending money for wars and collecting interest while soldiers died paying the cost. Now Lockheed Martin, or more accurately, the companies that merged to become Lockheed Martin, because military aviation has been profitable since World War I. The Loughead brothers, later spelled Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912. By World War I, they were building planes for the military, small contracts, experimental designs, but aviation was the future, and the companies that got in early positioned themselves for a century of profits. World War I saw limited use of aircraft, reconnaissance mostly, some bombing, but the potential was clear. After the war, military aviation contracts dried up. Many aircraft companies went bankrupt. Lockheed survived by building civilian planes, but they kept their military connections alive. World War II was the breakthrough. Aircraft were decisive. Bombers, fighters, transports, all essential. Lockheed built the P-38 Lightning fighter, over 10,000 produced. They built the Hudson bomber, over 2,800 produced. The contracts were worth hundreds of millions. But here's the Lockheed innovation. They didn't just build planes, they built relationships with the Pentagon. They hired former military officers as executives. They located factories in congressional districts where representatives needed jobs for constituents. They made themselves politically untouchable. After World War II, the Cold War kept contracts flowing. Lockheed built the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, the C-130 cargo plane, still in use today. Every decade brought new contracts. And Lockheed's strategy was always the same. Build good enough products, underestimate costs, get the contract, then come back for more money because the project is more complex than expected. The Pentagon always paid because canceling the project meant admitting waste. The C-5 Galaxy transport plane is the perfect example. Initial contract in 1965 for $2.1 billion. By delivery, actual cost was $5.3 billion, 150% over budget. Did Lockheed lose money? No. Cost plus contract. They got paid all costs plus profit. The Pentagon couldn't cancel because they'd already spent billions, so they paid. Lockheed profited. And Congress approved it because the factory employed thousands in Georgia, a key state, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. Every conflict brought Lockheed contracts. By the 1990s, the military-industrial complex was consolidating. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta in 1995 to become Lockheed Martin. Today, they're the largest defense contractor in the world. $65 billion in revenue in 2023, 90% from government contracts. And the pattern continues. The F-35 fighter jet, the most expensive weapons program in history. Original budget, $233 billion. Current estimate, over $1.7 trillion. That's trillion with a T, 7 times over budget. And Lockheed is getting paid. Every cost overrun, the Pentagon covers. Because they can't cancel. Too much invested. Too many jobs at stake. Too many congressional districts dependent on the program. The Lockheed family doesn't directly control the company anymore. It's publicly traded. But the shareholders profit, and the pattern established over a century continues. War is declared. Lockheed's stock price rises. Contracts are awarded. Costs overrun. Government pays. Shareholders profit. Repeat. Now Halliburton, Military Logistics, the company that turned war support into an art form. Halliburton was founded in 1919 by Earl Halliburton. Initially, it was an oil services company, cementing oil wells. But the founder understood that infrastructure, whether for oil or military, was lucrative. By World War II, Halliburton was building bases, airfields, and ports for the military. The pattern was simple. Military needs infrastructure fast. Halliburton has the expertise and equipment. They get no bid contracts because there's no time for competitive bidding. They build the facility. Cost plus contract means they get paid all expenses plus guaranteed profit. They can't lose money. Korea saw Halliburton build bases and infrastructure. Vietnam was bigger. Halliburton, through its subsidiary Brown and Root, built roads, ports, and airfields throughout South Vietnam. The contracts were worth billions, and they were awarded without competitive bidding because Brown and Root had political connections. Here's where the political connection becomes critical. George Brown, founder of Brown and Root, was a major donor to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson's political career was partly funded by Brown. When Johnson became president, Brown and Root got massive contracts for Vietnam infrastructure. Coincidence? Maybe, but the pattern is clear. Political donations, access to power, government contracts, profit. The Gulf War in 1991 brought Halliburton back. Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense. Halliburton got contracts to build facilities in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. After the war, Cheney left government and became CEO of Halliburton in 1995. He ran the company until 2000 when he became vice president under George W. Bush. And then came Iraq and Afghanistan. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, got contracts worth over $40 billion. No bid contracts, cost plus pricing. Halliburton built bases, provided food services, supplied fuel, managed logistics, and the costs were astronomical. The Pentagon Inspector General found billions in waste and overcharges. Halliburton billed the government for meals never served, for fuel deliveries that never happened, for construction that was never completed. And when questioned, Halliburton argued that war zones are chaotic and some waste is inevitable. The government agreed and kept paying. Dick Cheney, as vice president, recused himself from contract decisions involving Halliburton. But his former company got more contracts during his tenure than in any previous period. From 2003 to 2008, Halliburton's government contracts increased by 400%. Their stock price tripled. And when Cheney left office in 2009, he still held Halliburton stock options worth millions. This is the pattern. Company hires politicians as executives. Those executives build relationships in government. When wars start, those relationships turn into contracts, and the profit is shared. Politicians retire wealthy, companies get richer, and taxpayers pay the bill. Now let me show you the pattern across all five. Because it's not just that these families profited from war, it's how they profited. The same strategy repeated for 150 years. Step 1. Position before the war. All five companies established themselves as essential before conflict began. DuPont built explosive manufacturing capacity during peacetime. Rockefeller monopolized oil refining. Morgan built banking relationships. Lockheed maintained military contracts between wars. Halliburton built infrastructure expertise. When war started, they were ready. Competitors weren't. Step 2. Get the first contract. Government needs supplies immediately. No time for competitive bidding. The companies already positioned get no bid contracts. The justification is always national security. We can't wait for bids. We need it now. And once you have the first contract, the next ones are easier. You're the proven supplier. Step 3, cost plus pricing. Almost every major war contract from the Civil War onward was cost plus. The contractor bills the government for all costs plus a guaranteed percentage profit. This removes all risk. If costs overrun, the government pays. If the project takes longer, the contractor makes more profit. The incentive is to maximize costs, not minimize them. Step 4, overrun the budget. Every single major weapon system in the last 50 years has come in over budget. The F-35, 7 times over. The Zumwalt destroyer, 3 times over. The littoral combat ship, double. This isn't incompetence, it's the business model. Underbid to get the contract, then revise estimates upward. The government can't cancel because they've already invested, so they pay, and the contractor profits from the overrun. Step 5, hire the regulators. When military officers retire, where do they go? Defense contractors. Generals who approved Lockheed contracts become Lockheed executives. Admirals who oversaw shipbuilding join shipbuilding companies. The revolving door between Pentagon and industry is so established it has a name, and it ensures that the people awarding contracts maintain relationships that benefit them later. Step 6, lobby for more war. This is the darkest part. Defense contractors spend millions lobbying Congress. They donate to campaigns. They fund think tanks that produce papers advocating military intervention. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, the American Enterprise Institute, both receive funding from defense contractors, and both consistently publish research supporting military action. When Iraq was being debated in 2002, defense contractors funded organizations that produced intelligence reports supporting invasion. They paid for advertisements. They hired former generals to appear on news shows advocating war. And when war was approved, those same contractors got billions in contracts. Did they create the Iraq War? No. But they created an environment where war was more likely. And they profited when it happened. Step 7. Diversify the profit. War profits don't stay in weapons. DuPont used explosive profits to build a chemical empire. Rockefeller used oil profits to buy banks and real estate. Morgan used war lending profits to finance peacetime industries. The companies diversify so that even when wars end, the wealth remains. And the families behind these companies become dynasties, multi-generational wealth built on war. Now, let me show you the scale. How much profit are we talking about? DuPont's total revenue from military contracts since 1802 is estimated at over $50 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars. Rockefeller companies, over $100 billion in fuel sales to military since 1898. Morgan Banks, interest and fees from war financing, estimated at over $75 billion. Lockheed Martin and predecessors, over $200 billion in aircraft and systems since 1917. Halliburton, over $60 billion in logistics and infrastructure since 1942. Total, these 5 companies and their predecessors have extracted over $485 billion from American taxpayers through war contracts. That's documented, publicly available contract values. It doesn't include indirect profits, stock price increases, real estate bought with war profits, industries built using war capital. If you included that, the number is over $1 trillion. And here's the critical detail. That money came from taxpayers. Every dollar paid to DuPont for explosives was taken from American workers through taxes. Every dollar paid to Halliburton for logistics came from deficit spending that future generations will repay. These aren't normal business profits. These are public funds transferred to private hands, justified by war. Now the question you should be asking, is this still happening? Yes. Right now, let me show you the current numbers. 2023, the U.S. military budget was $816 billion. The 5 largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, received over $200 billion in contracts. That's 25% of the entire defense budget going to 5 companies. And the pattern continues. Now, these companies employ former Pentagon officials. They lobby Congress. They locate factories strategically. The F-35 program, built by Lockheed, has suppliers in 45 states. That's intentional. It means 90 senators have constituents employed by the program. Voting against the F-35 means voting against jobs in your state. So Congress keeps funding it, even though it's 7 times over budget, even though it's years behind schedule, even though it has over 800 documented defects. The pattern established by DuPont in 1802 continues today. War is profitable. For companies, for shareholders, for executives, for politicians who get donations and jobs after retirement. The only people who don't profit are the soldiers who fight and the taxpayers who pay. Now let me show you something that should make you angry, the opportunity cost. What could America have built with $485 billion if it hadn't gone to war profits? $485 billion could fund free college for every American student for 20 years. It could build high-speed rail connecting every major city. It could fund universal health care for a decade. It could rebuild every bridge and road in the country. It could fund cancer research for a century. But instead, it bought explosives, fuel, weapons, and logistics for wars, some necessary, many not. And the companies profited while the public good suffered. This isn't about whether wars were justified. Some were. World War II was necessary. But even necessary wars were exploited for profit. And many wars were encouraged, prolonged, or escalated because it was profitable. Vietnam could have ended years earlier, but defense contractors lobbied to continue. Iraq was sold on false intelligence, partly produced by contractor-funded think tanks. Afghanistan became a 20-year occupation, partly because contractors made billions rebuilding what we destroyed. The profit motive didn't create these wars, but it made them longer and more expensive than they needed to be. Here's the final piece of the pattern. The families are untouchable. Despite evidence of overcharging, of fraud, of profiteering, no one goes to jail. DuPont was investigated for explosive monopoly practices in the 1930s. Nothing happened. Standard Oil was broken up for monopoly, but the Rockefellers kept the wealth and the companies reunited over time. Morgan banks were investigated for war profiteering after World War I. No prosecutions. Halliburton was investigated for overcharging in Iraq. They paid a fine, kept the contracts, and continued profiting. Lockheed was investigated for bribing foreign officials to buy weapons. They paid a fine. The executives faced no jail time. The pattern is consistent. Investigations find wrongdoing. Fines are paid. The fines are a fraction of the profits. No individuals are prosecuted. The companies continue operating. The pattern continues. Because these companies are too important to prosecute. The military depends on them. Congress depends on them for jobs in their districts. The economy depends on them, so they're protected, even when they break the law. 5 families. 5 companies, 150 years, every major American war, and the pattern is identical every time. Position before the war, get the contracts, overrun the costs, hire the regulators, lobby for more, profit while others die. This isn't conspiracy, this is documented history. The contracts are public, the profits are recorded. The pattern is undeniable, and it's still happening right now. The only question is whether anyone will stop it. History says they won't, because the companies are too powerful, the politicians are too dependent, and the public is too distracted to care. If this changed how you see military spending, if you finally understand that war is a business model, then you're starting to see the pattern. 5 families, billions in profit, built on wars that killed millions. Subscribe if you want to understand how power actually works. Because they're not going to teach you this in school. They're going to teach you that these companies are patriotic, that they serve the nation, that war profiteering is a conspiracy theory. But the contracts are public record, and the pattern has repeated for 150 years. 5 families, every war, same result. They profit, we pay, and soldiers die.